It gives me enormous pleasure, and I consider it a great privilege to have this opportunity to be amongst this distinguished audience here. First of all, my humble respects to the distinguished speakers, guests, and all of you who are attending this workshop. I must offer my congratulations to Professor Lakshmidhar Behera, who has conceptualized this whole activity of the Indian Knowledge Systems department here at IIT Mandi, a very unique initiative, and to organize such a conference. And along with him, I would like to thank and express gratitude to all those who are involved in this wonderful initiative. So Dr. Behera he persuaded me to come here, and I'm happy that I accepted his earnest invitation. I was thinking about a topic that would offer a different perspective to the subject of consciousness, body, mind, brain, and so on, than the one that is offered in the modern knowledge systems of today. Some of these things we have already heard with great scholarship and devotion in the few hours that we have been here today. The topic I have chosen is the passenger in the chariot. And for those of you who are more familiar with the spiritual topics, you already have understood that it alludes to a certain metaphor in the Upanishads, and I will come to it shortly and it will become clear. So consciousness, of course, has become a subject of great discussion and debate and research, and in terms of the number of publications per year, it has risen very, very sharply in recent years. We had a comment earlier on that modern science seems to have reached some level of stagnation. No breakthroughs of any momentous nature are on the horizon like there were in the early part of the 20th century, and which is why perhaps consciousness has emerged in such a big way. We have heard about the subject and the object, and our Shastras teach us how understanding the subject is even more important than understanding the object. So therefore, consciousness has indeed become a very important topic for discussion, and it is the intersection between science, philosophy, spirituality. Let's begin with a preliminary definition of consciousness. Of course, I use the word preliminary with some purpose, and I'll come to it in a moment. Some definitions that we can all relate to are the idea that I exist, I am aware of my being, of my existence. We all know that statement of Descartes where he says, I think, therefore I am. Consciousness is a matter of experience. I think, I feel, I will, therefore I am conscious. Consciousness is also what distinguishes the living from the dead. So why do I use the word preliminary here? Does it mean that these definitions of consciousness are incorrect? No, they are correct. But the point is that we may not have the tools to understand the existence of consciousness in all situations and circumstances. We may not be able to detect consciousness in some places where indeed it exists. So therefore, while there are certainly signs of consciousness everywhere all around us, they may not always be empirically discernible. Also, we learn from our Vedic Shastras that consciousness may often be very deeply covered. In fact, so deeply covered that they practically seem to us to be devoid of consciousness. But for one who sees through what we call Shastra Chakshu or Divya Chakshu, which means the eyes of the scripture or divine eyes, then one understands that consciousness exists indeed in a far more pervasive way than perhaps is superficially and empirically understandable. That is why I have used the word preliminary consciousness, a definition of consciousness, and we may have to explore the idea in this talk of whether consciousness can have an absolute existence beyond transcending any relativistic circumstantial situations. Is there something called consciousness which doesn't depend on time, place and circumstance? It may be covered, it may not be covered, but is there something that can always manifest? As far as the modern perspective on consciousness is concerned, it is considered an emergent property of brain activity. In other words, what modern science says now is that consciousness as we understand it is something that emerges or it arises from the brain, from complex interactions within the brain, from coordinated neural networks. So it is something that is not independent of the body, specifically of the brain. It is because of certain electrochemical interactions within the brain, the neural interactions and so on, that we have this phenomenon that we call consciousness. Further, modern research in neuroscience has established that certain functions or certain parts of the brain display certain functions, or they are associated with certain feelings, certain emotions, and therefore there is a correlation that is established. Now, there are some questions that arise because of these postulations, and I would like to just mention about two of those questions without going deeper, because that would go beyond the scope of today's talk. The first question that arises is, yes, indeed, empirically it has been demonstrated that there is an association of certain situational emotions, feelings, functions with certain parts of the brain. But does such association and correlation necessarily imply, or is it equal to causation? Because there is a functional relationship, a correlational kind of status that has been established, does it mean that the brain or those parts of the brain are indeed the source of those feelings? Does it mean a particular part of the brain is responsible for love, another part of the brain responsible for creativity? Does correlation establish causality? That is the first question that we need to ask. Another question that emerges is that if indeed consciousness emerges from the brain, how are electrochemical signals experienced as sound, color, taste, smell, etc.? This is a very important question. It needs some thought. When the senses receive stimuli from the outside world, either through the ears, the eyes, and so on, these stimuli enter into the brain. They are transformed into some kind of electrochemical signals in the neural networks of the brain. But we experience something when we look at a beautiful sunset or a sunrise, or we come to Mandi and we see the beautiful nature around us. There is a sense of awe and joy that we feel. Now surely some neurons are being triggered somewhere in the brain, some electrochemical reactions are going on, but what is it that translates these electrochemical interactions into the actual experience of seeing that sunrise, that sunset, and so on. In other words, how does one understand what the word experience is? What is this phenomenon called experience? I experience a light, a sunset or a sunlight, or I experience the beauty of a rose, or I smell the fragrance of a rose. I have an experience when I do this. What is that relationship? How do those electrochemical reactions translate into such experience? So these are some things that are hard questions that modern science needs to answer. And therefore, I think it is good that a different perspective is needed. And this is where the traditional knowledge systems of India, originating in the various Vedic literatures available, can shed some very, very useful light for us. So we will present today an alternative paradigm or a perspective from Vedic knowledge. We have heard many things today about this, and essentially the point is that consciousness is a fundamental non-material phenomenon. Modern science is primarily dealing with matter, but we are speaking about something that is fundamentally non-matter, and that is consciousness. So let's look at what the treasure house of our literatures from ancient India tell us. We have the various Upanishads, we have the Vedas, we have the Srimad Bhagavatam, we have the Bhagavad Gita, and we have an enormous reservoir of such literatures that will give us so much understanding in so much depth about the subject of consciousness. And coming to this whole idea of the passenger in the chariot, this passage is found, or this concept is found in many places in the Vedic literature. We have some reference in the Anugita of the Mahabharata, which is a conversation that Lord Krishna had with Arjuna after the battle. The Bhagavad Gita is a conversation he had before, and the Anugita is a conversation, amongst others, that he had later. We also find that in some of the Upanishads and other places. But most of all, this analogy is found in the Katha Upanishad. So the Vedic knowledge gives us deep insights into this, and while it's a topic of epistemology, of understanding knowledge and exploring why and how we acquire knowledge and what is the relative strength of each source of knowledge, but we will not be getting into that. The purpose of my paper or talk today is merely to present this knowledge, not to deal with, shall we say, proving epistemological issues. So here is a conversation in the Katha Upanishad between a young lad called Nachiketa and the god of death, Yama. And Nachiketa has asked him some questions. He asks him, is there anything beyond death? Is there life beyond death? And what is the truth about this? He also asks him about the formula for attaining real happiness and how should one end sorrow. He also asks him about the nature of the Atman, or the soul, and about its destination after death. In the course of this very momentous and celebrated conversation, we have this one verse that gives what we call the Ratha Kalpana, the parable of the Ratha or the chariot, or the example, the metaphor of the chariot. Atmanam rathanam vidhi shariram ratham evacha buddhim tu sarathim vidhi manah pragraham evacha indriyani hayanahu vishayansteshu gocharan atmendri mano yuktam bhoktetyahur manishinaha. Atmanam rathanam vidhi. The individual is the passenger in the chariot. Shariram ratham evacha. The body is the ratha or the chariot. Buddhim tu sarathim. So the intelligence is the sarathi or the driver. Manaha pragraham evacha. And the mind is a driving instrument, which means the reins by which the horses are held. And the senses are the horses, indriyani hayan ahu, vishayams teshu gocharan. And the paths on which the horses tread, they represent the sense objects which the senses are after. And ultimately it is a self. There is a concept of the Atma or the self that in the association of the body and mind is trying to understand or enjoy the objects of the senses through the senses. So this is Ahur Manishinaha. So the great thinkers have understood it like that. So here is a pictorial depiction of this chariot, the Ratha Kalpana. You can examine the various components of this Ratha. First of all, you see the 5 horses, which represent the indriyas or the senses. And overall, the physical component can be called the body or the sharira. So the Ratha and the horses, they represent what we could call the sharira. But that's not all. You have something else. You have the reins which are tying the horses, and this is the manas, the mind. And the driver of the chariot is the buddhi or the intelligence. And at the same time there is a passenger in the chariot, and that is the Atma. So let us now try to examine briefly each of these components. So the first component are the horses, the senses. We are all familiar with the senses. Specifically here we are talking about what are called the Jnanendriyas, the indriyas by which we gather knowledge about our environment. And we principally have 5 of these Jnanendriyas. They have a subtle component and also a gross component, but we will not go too much into that at this time. The hearing, the function of the ears is to hear sound. When we hear pleasing sounds, then the ear tends to go towards that, we like it. That processing is done at the next stage of the mind, but the ear tries to engage with sound. The nose engages with the sense of smell. The tongue engages with the sense of taste. And the skin engages with the sense of touch. And the eyes engage with the sense of vision. And the senses are constantly seeking gratification through these various sense objects. And therefore there is some kind of interaction that takes place between the senses and the sense objects. And because of that, there is some experience. And with that, we come to the manas. The mind is what is seeking that pleasure. The mind is expecting some happiness, but sometimes there is no happiness, there is the opposite of distress. Sankalpa vikalpo manaha. So the mind is constantly accepting and rejecting. So we accept what is pleasing, and we reject what is not pleasing. So the mind is constantly doing that. When the ear hears some very pleasing sounds, then we become attracted. When there is a discordant note somewhere, then it's not pleasing. So the mind is constantly seeking pleasure through the senses engaged in the sense objects. So let's talk a little bit about the mind. According to our Shastras, the mind essentially has 3 functions, the first of which is thinking. By thinking, of course, as we understand, we refer to having thoughts and reflections. Conscious entities think. It is not possible to be thoughtless, because thinking is an inseparable characteristic of consciousness. So thinking, we have thoughts, we have reflections. These thoughts, especially in association with matter, then it gives rise to desires. And the mind is a storehouse of such desires accumulated from time immemorial. The second function of the mind is feeling, where we experience emotions and sensations. The mind, of course, is not the ultimate experiencer. It is an intermediary, and we have heard in the few hours before this that there is an interface between the true consciousness and the senses of the body, and that is the mind. So it is the mind that enables us, or that experiences these different sensations: pleasure, pain, happiness, distress. Sometimes we feel excited, sometimes we feel dull. And then there is a willing element or aspect of the mind which induces one to act in a certain way. So it is manifest as the activities in the body. So when I see a very delicious foodstuff, then that I see a gulab jamun, the signal is going through my eyes, it is being processed, sent to the brain, and then is having some electrochemical impulses. The mind is now the storehouse of the desire. The mind says, yes, I want to taste that gulab jamun. So then my karmendriyas also act, my legs, my hands, my voice, etc. And I go and get that gulab jamun and I taste it. And that, then a thinking, feeling, willing, all of these ultimately then are driven by the mind. Let's come now to the intelligence. Now the intelligence is what comes before the mind. The intelligence is what discriminates. The capacity to understand, discern, and discriminate is what intelligence is. We all have intelligence, even the lower species of life. To a lesser or a greater degree, every conscious entity has some intelligence. It may be manifested to a larger or a smaller degree. The Srimad Bhagavatam also explains that the functions of intelligence are to help in ascertaining the nature of objects when they come into view and to help the senses. So when I desire, for example, to eat the gulab jamun, now my intelligence works. My mind is prompting me to want that gulab jamun. Now my intelligence starts working. Where is a gulab jamun available? What can I do to procure this gulab jamun? So in that sense, the intelligence is acting to assist the senses. And then we go beyond. The intelligence now discriminates. If I go over here, then I get this kind of gulab jamun. If I go there, I may not get a gulab jamun. In this way, the intelligence is constantly working in the normal state that we are in, not in a spiritually evolved state, but in the normal state. The intelligence acts and uses its sense of discrimination to assist the senses in achieving what they wish, so that the mind can experience some pleasure. Now, we experience mostly in this world intelligence acting in a negative fashion, in a harmful fashion. And we all know very well that a great deal of damage that is done to the world is done not by those who are not intelligent. The maximum damage is inflicted on this earth by people who are very intelligent. So that is intelligence that is misguided or misplaced. So when intelligence is seen in isolation of the fundamental source of consciousness in the chariot, that is the driver, or rather the passenger, the source of consciousness, that intelligence then becomes misdirected and is engaged then in harmful activities. Therefore, the Srimad Bhagavatam mentions some characteristics of intelligence, like, for example, correct apprehension, misapprehension, and also doubt. So doubting is a very important characteristic of intelligence. An intelligent person doubts. An intelligent person has questions. An intelligent person doesn't accept everything and anything at face value. This inquisitive nature is also something fundamental to us. And I may make an incidental comment here. We see many times that those people who are spreading philosophies that are godless, that are completely materialistic and very harmful, and we see a lot of that in the world today. For example, this philosophy of wokeism that is popular, I'm sure you've all heard of it now. So why are these philosophies coming up, and why are our best brains going towards these topics rather than delving on sublime spiritual topics? We had in the past great saints, great rishis, intellectual giants of their times. They engaged their intelligence, their sense of discrimination and study on such spiritual matters. And today we find a whole range of intellectuals who, instead of giving their intellectual input into such matters of consciousness based on our scriptures, based on spiritual understanding, they rather speculate and come up with something that eventually becomes harmful. So therefore, when the Srimad Bhagavatam says that doubt is an element of intelligence, if that intelligence is not being governed, if the power of that intelligence is not being channelized and regulated and controlled properly, that intelligence will also be misdirected, and therefore it will hold the chariot or the reins and direct the mind in another way. The mind will not be able to control the horses of the senses, and this chariot will move in a haywire, in a method. So in other words, having pure intelligence is very important. So we come to the next point, which is the Atma, the intelligence, the source of consciousness, the Atma. If the intelligence is connected to the Atma, and the Atma is connected to the Paramatma, then the intelligence becomes pure. That pure intelligence is very powerful to do good to the world. It is powerful to unravel the deepest mysteries and secrets of this world. But if the intelligence is not in touch with the Atma, in simpler words to say, one doesn't have the sanskars, the spiritual sanskars, the cultural sanskars from this life and the previous life, then that intelligence will act as an agency for causing tremendous harm to the world by evolving all sorts of philosophies. It's not a new phenomenon. Lord Krishna has spoken about this in chapter 16 of the Bhagavad Gita in the Asuri Bhava, how the people who are devoid of God consciousness tend to evolve all sorts of speculative, harmful philosophies. So therefore, the Atma is very important. If one becomes connected to one's own being, then automatically the intelligence, the mind, the senses, they all become purified, and one's whole existence, the body, soul, mind, intelligence combination moves in a very wholesome, beneficial direction. So just a few short verses from the scriptures about the nature of this consciousness. The Bhagavad Gita says, Avinashi tu tad viddhi, yena sarvamidam tatam, vinasham abhyayasyasya, na kaschit kartum arhati. Avinashi. So there is something, this Atma is Avinashi, it is not destroyed. Tu tad viddhi, we should know. Yena sarvam idam tatam, that which is spread all over inside the body, that is Avinashi. So what is being referred to here is consciousness. The consciousness is spread all over the body from the tip of the finger to the top of the head to the tip of the toe. So it is because consciousness is all pervading in the body that we are able to perceive and sense. So this is all over, and vinasham avyayasyasya. So avyaya, that imperishable Atma, it cannot be destroyed. Vinasham na kaschit kartum arhati. So no one can destroy this imperishable soul. Also in the Mundaka Upanishad, I have not put the Sanskrit just to save time. I'll read only the translation. The soul is atomic in size and can be perceived by perfect intelligence. The atomic soul is floating in the 5 kinds of air: prana, apana, vyana, samana and udana. The soul is situated within the heart and it spreads its influence all over the body of the embodied living entities. When the soul is purified from the contamination of the 5 kinds of material air, its spiritual influence is exhibited. So a couple of important points made here. One is about the size of the soul, that is very, very tiny. It is atomic. You see, there is a problem when people try to understand spiritual subjects like the soul purely from the modern empirical point of view. It is not possible. First of all, it is very tiny, but as we come to a bit of an ontological discussion in a minute or two, it will become more clear. The second here is that it is floating, so to speak, in the 5 airs, subtle airs. These different airs, according to yoga philosophy, are responsible for the functioning of different organs within the body. So the Atma is floating in that. It is situated within the heart. Within the heart indicates in the region of the heart. It is not a part of the heart in the sense that the veins and the other chambers of the heart are. It is not something gross or even something subtle. It's subtler than the subtlest. It's completely a different category altogether. Again from the Bhagavad Gita, for the soul there is neither birth nor death at any time. He has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. He is unborn, eternal, ever existing, and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. So we are referring here to the Atma. In English we can call it soul, but it's a word that is much misunderstood. So we can call it the Jiva soul, or just the Jivatma, or the Atma. So now, having taken a brief look at all the different components of this passengers and the chariot, let us see the hierarchy within the chariot. So the Bhagavad Gita again says, Indriyani paranyahur indriyabhyah param manaha manasastu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And the soul is even higher than intelligence. So we see the hierarchy here from dull matter to working senses to mind, intelligence and Atma. So we see here such a very intricate, elaborate, precise understanding of these different terms. Mind, intelligence, consciousness, a very clear delineation of all these different terms that are stated in our Shastras. Let's take a brief look at Vedic ontology. It's a topic in itself, but suffice it to say here at this time that ontology essentially is a study of reality. It is a study of what exists. And I'd like to refer to a particular word called vastu from Sanskrit. It is derived from the verbal root vas, means to exist. So vastu means that which exists. Now normally in our everyday discussion in Indian languages, we use the word vastu and we have a picture in mind. We refer to some kind of a physical localized object. Like we say this microphone. It's a vastu. It's an object. But we can understand from the definition of the word vastu that it doesn't refer merely to the gross physical localized objects. It refers to anything that exists. For example, air. We all know it exists, but it's not localized. It's physical in the sense that we can touch it. It engages a sense of touch. But it's still everywhere. So it exists. So similarly, there are items that are even subtler than air, and there is a progressive hierarchy of these things that has been described in our Vedic literature. So let's speak therefore about two ontological categories that emerge from our Shastras, from our scriptures. The first one could call Chit Vastu, or two types of Vastus, two types of things that exist. Chit Vastu. The word Chit essentially means consciousness, and it is used synonymously with the word spiritual. So therefore, when we speak of Chit Vastu or Chid Vastu, we are referring to spiritual substance, the stuff of which the Atma is made. It's something fundamentally ontologically different from that which this microphone is made or which the air is made, etc. So it is in a distinct ontological category. And the qualities of this Chit Vastu have been mentioned here as being conscious, eternal, blissful, and always manifest. As opposed to this, there is a second ontological category which we can call Achit Vastu. That Vastu, or those Vastus which are Achit, which means not conscious or not spiritual. So not spiritual means material. So we call it material substance, and we can call it matter for short. And these have opposite qualities to the Chit Vastu. So therefore, matter in and of itself is not conscious. The forms of matter are ever changing, even though matter and energy themselves are eternal, but the forms which they assume will change. Matter is not blissful. Matter is sometimes manifest and sometimes not manifest. When we say that Chit Vastu is always manifest, it doesn't necessarily appear to be like that to those who don't have the vision. It is manifest to those who have the vision. Then let's come to how we can apply these two ontological categories to the Atma and to the body. So the Atma is Chit Vastu, and the body is Achit Vastu. But as we have seen, the body has many components. There are the senses, there is the mind, there is the intelligence. So from the Bhagavad Gita and the other Vedic literature, we can understand that the body, the Achit Vastu, has two parts or two types: the gross body, the Sthula Sharira, and the subtle body, the Sukshma Sharira. The gross body consists of earth, water, fire, air, ether, what we could in ordinary language call, say, solidity, liquidity, energy or radiation, gaseous substances, air, and space. And the subtle body, or the Sukshma Sharira, consists of the mind, intelligence, and false ego. And each of these 8 elements, as we understand from the Bhagavad Gita, are progressively getting subtler and subtler. So earth is the grossest of them, and the false ego is the subtlest of them. And these 3 elements all are essentially one type of substance, the subtle matter. The Srimad Bhagavatam says that they essentially are categorized only in terms of functionality, because they have different functions. So when it functions to experience emotions and so on, is called the mind. When it functions to analyze things, discriminate, is called the intelligence. And when there is a sense of false identification with the soul, when it identifies with the body, that's called the false ego. So the Atma therefore is covered by 2 bodies: the gross body, consisting of the senses, the brain, the other organs, and so on, and the subtle body consisting of the mind, intelligence, false ego. There are some other components too, which I am not mentioning here. And these bodies are actually there which cover the soul. So what is death? Death is when the embodied soul, the soul that is within the body, leaves the body and goes elsewhere. Dehinosmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tatha dehantara praptehe dhiras tatra namuhyati. As the embodied soul continuously passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. In other words, the Atma being imperishable and the body being perishable, what happens when the body perishes? As it inevitably will. So that the Atma will leave this body and take up another body. And in this way, the Atma travels through various species of life. Inasmuch as we change our clothes, the Atma goes from one body to another, maybe in the same species, maybe in another species, and it goes on in an interminable cycle, which is called the wheel of samsara, the cycle of birth and death. When the intelligence is focused on the achit vastu or material substance, the mind and senses being attached to matter are uncontrolled. And because of the uncontrolled mind and senses, the Atma remains bound in the cycle of birth and death. However, when the intelligence is focused on chit vastu, the spiritual substance, then the mind and senses come under control, the Atma becomes liberated. Having explained this, now Yama tells Nachiketa, for one, that is in the second category here, for the man who has discriminating intellect for the driver and a controlling mind for the reins, reaches the end of the road, that is the highest place of Vishnu. Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. So in other words, Yama is outlining to Nachiketa in the Katha Upanishad how this whole Atma, mind, body, senses combination can be used to attain the ultimate perfection and the object of life. So this is how these different components of the Ratha have been, of this chariot, the passenger and the chariot have been delineated in the Katha Upanishad. The passenger is, of course, the consciousness, the source of the consciousness. So the conclusion, therefore, is that consciousness is an intrinsic characteristic of the Chidvastu, the spiritual Atma, and not an emergent property of Achitvastu or matter. So I will stop here. Thank you all very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Maharaj, for your very wonderful and systematic presentation of Chit Vastu and Achit Vastu and the process of enlightenment by which the Atma can be liberated from the cycle of being conditioned by the matter. So with that, I seek some questions. Yeah.
When you were going over this with a lot of clarity, put a lot of things into perspective, I was reminded of another mantra in Katha Upanishad. Anityehi dravyehi praptavanasmi nityam. Is there any sort of connection with that, the meaning of that mantra and this whole Ratha Kalpana and the whole idea of discriminating, having a discriminative intelligence to, look at things apart and finding your own self?
Yes, you see, discrimination is what distinguishes success from failure. And discrimination is the most important treasure that we can have. But as I mentioned earlier, if that discrimination is connected to the Atma, to the source of our true consciousness, then there is auspiciousness and wholesomeness that emerges. But if the intelligence is disconnected, the sense of discrimination, then will lead to unwholesome destinations.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr. Kunal Malik.
Yeah, I'm Kunal, professor at IIT Kanpur. Thank you very much for that very clear and very detailed investigation of matter, subtle matter, etc. I was also hoping to ask this question to Sri Ravi Shankar ji, but I'll also ask you. The level of sophistication that we have achieved in terms of studying gross matter in laboratories through different kinds of techniques, equipments, is really, unparalleled anywhere in terms of study of any other kind of things that you have spoken about. What are the kind of practices or laboratories that we will need to build in order to reach that level of sophistication in understanding subtle matter and consciousness that we have achieved in science, and that will really maybe impress upon scientific circles that yes, we must take this up because this is highly intellectually defined topics related to mind and consciousness and what they are.
You see, as Dr. Behera has explained earlier, we are not opposed to science, but we want to integrate the modern approach to science with our traditional knowledge systems. Now, modern science has a certain methodology which is essentially empirical in nature. It is outward looking. And our Shastras speak about a system that is essentially inward looking. Now, it is very hard with a purely outward looking methodology that demands empirical evidence to understand the veracity of everything that is spoken in our Shastras. Even to understand this whole passenger and chariot thing and to demonstrate it visibly, empirically, it may not be possible because every branch of knowledge has to be understood on its own terms. Nevertheless, to the degree that is possible, modern tools, modern methods could be utilized to circumstantially or in some way establish the truth of these statements or the existence of these subcategories that we have talked about. But fundamentally, to be able to understand what this is all about, it needs the inner exploration directed by another kind of methodology which we have to accept. And that is something that requires, as Honorable Srivatsa Goswami mentioned, the vinamrata, the humility. When that humility of heart gets exposed to this higher spiritual knowledge and proponents of that spiritual knowledge, then the consciousness actually opens up to accepting all of this. If we as a race become very proud of our intellectual prowess, that we have attained so much of technological advancement, that pride will prohibit us from accessing this higher grade of knowledge, because this requires a fundamental humility.
No, I know there are a lot of questions. We are actually getting late, and Maharaj is here. You can all ask questions.
Yeah.
Now our next session will start. The normal technical sessions and the workshop will start. Can you?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Maharaj, please come for the presentation.
Thank you. I would request our Honorable Director Sir to kindly participate in the service. Thank you.
So he has been my spiritual mentor for a long time, and I am very, very grateful that you are here, and I hope all of you enjoyed his very enlightened talk. Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you.